August 26, 1346. The rain has soaked the fields of northern France, turning the ground to mud and misery. On one hill, 9,000 exhausted Englishmen brace for battle. Across the valley, 30,000 French soldiers gleam in polished armor, their banners snapping in the wind, confident, noble, unstoppable. The French hold every advantage: cavalry, numbers, and pride. Their nobles don't wonder if they will win, only who will seize the English king first. 4 hours later, their arrogance lies broken in the mud. Over 1,000 French nobles, princes, dukes, heirs to ancient names, are dead. The English, 40 men lost, not hundreds. 40. 5 centuries of knightly supremacy collapse in a single afternoon, not to swords or charges, but to arrows, simple weapons wielded by peasants who had practiced every Sunday because the law demanded it. A blind king rides willingly to his death rather than flee defeat. French knights crush their own allies in panic. Mercenaries die at the hands of those who paid them. Above the silence that follows, crows grow so heavy on noble flesh, they can scarcely take flight. This is Crécy, the day chivalry drowned in its own pride. The day valor was outmatched by discipline. The moment peasants with bows ended the reign of men born to rule. By the end of this story, you'll see how 10-shilling bows shattered 1,000-pound armor, and how one blind king's death became legend. The summer of 1346 was hot, tense, and soaked in smoke. Edward III of England had crossed the Channel with 15,000 men, a mix of knights, archers, and hardened infantry, not for conquest, but for humiliation. His claim to the French throne was bold, almost reckless, yet every mile he advanced through Normandy sent a single message to King Philip VI: you cannot protect your own land. What followed was not war in the traditional sense, but devastation with royal approval. Edward's campaign was called a chevauchée, a sanctioned rampage. Villages burned, granaries were emptied, and towns were looted until their church bells melted. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was strategy. Every torch lit by the English was a symbol of France's failure to defend itself. When the city of Caen fell, its walls crumbled beneath the English assault in a single day. The massacre that followed echoed across Europe. From the ruins, Edward's army turned north, driving toward the coast, aiming for the safety of Calais, English territory and a port of retreat. But behind them, like a gathering storm, Philip VI was assembling something the world hadn't seen in generations. The French king summoned every noble, duke, count, and knight of name or pride. From Burgundy to Bohemia, they came, men in polished armor, horses clad in steel, banners sewn with lions and lilies. Some rode for loyalty. Most rode for glory. To them, the English were thieves and vandals, unworthy of a proper fight. The nobles wanted spectacle, a battle worthy of song. As the French host gathered, its scale became a legend in itself. 30,000 men under one banner, 12,000 mounted knights, each one the product of wealth and breeding. These were not mercenaries or peasants, these were Europe's elites. The men who believed that blood determined destiny. And yet, as the army marched, its strength became its weakness. There were too many banners, too many egos. Nobles argued over command, over precedence, even over the order of their tents. The French court had spilled onto the battlefield, more ceremony than army. Behind all the pageantry, discipline evaporated like mist. Meanwhile, Edward was no fool. He knew the numbers were hopeless. Outnumbered 3-1, surrounded in foreign territory, he needed more than courage. He needed control. His men were exhausted, yes, but disciplined. His commanders were not chosen by birthright, but by competence. His archers, thousands of them, were the soul of his army. They were not noblemen. Most were criminals, farmers, or sons of labourers, the kind of men who had never worn silk but had drawn a bow since childhood. In England, it was the law. Every Sunday, every able-bodied man had to practice archery. It was not recreation. It was preparation. Their weapon was simple, a 6-foot stave of yew, carved and bent to lethal perfection. A peasant's tool, but one that could punch through armor, break bones, and stop a charge dead in its tracks. Each archer could loose 12 arrows a minute, enough to turn the sky into iron rain. Edward's army moved with purpose. Every step north was measured, every fire deliberate. He was not fleeing, he was luring. He wanted the French to follow, to grow confident, to make a mistake. And soon they would. By late August, Philip's army caught sight of the English near a small village called Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The French saw a tired enemy. The English saw a chance to end centuries of noble arrogance. Neither side realized that by sunset, the world they both understood, of knight's glory and divine right, would lie buried in the mud. The French army that answered King Philip VI's call was not merely vast, it was magnificent. From every corner of France and beyond, nobility rode in as if summoned to a coronation, not a campaign. Armor gleamed like mirrors in the sun. Plumes danced on helmets. Banners painted with lions, eagles, and fleurs-de-lis rippled across the horizon. It was not an army. It was a parade of pride. Philip VI believed he was assembling the greatest force Christendom had ever seen, 30,000 strong, including 12,000 mounted knights, and more lords and counts than could be counted in one breath. Beside them marched contingents from the Holy Roman Empire, Bohemia, and Burgundy, kings and princes eager to share in a swift and glorious victory. The air in the French camp pulsed with confidence. To these nobles, the English were little more than marauding peasants led by an ambitious king. Their war horses had been bred for generations to crush infantry beneath their hooves. Their armor was the finest in Europe, plate upon plate of tempered steel, forged by master smiths. Their swords were heirlooms, blessed by priests, carried by ancestors who had won crusades. They were warriors by birth and by divine decree. They had one weakness: arrogance. As the army advanced north toward Crécy, cracks began to form. The ranks grew stretched, the supply lines strained. French knights were accustomed to glory, not endurance. Some feasted while others went hungry. The lords argued over precedence. Who would lead the vanguard? Who would take the honor of striking the first blow? Who would capture Edward III alive for ransom? King Philip tried to keep order, but his commands were drowned in the noise of horns, laughter, and the constant clash of armor. His army was magnificent in sight, but hollow in discipline. What looked like unity was, in truth, chaos bound by pride. The English, by contrast, were shadows on the move. Edward's men knew the French were coming. The dust cloud alone could be seen from miles away. They marched deliberately, always keeping distance, leading their pursuers into the terrain of their choosing. For Edward, the battlefield was a chessboard, and the French were pieces already trapped by their own confidence. By the time Philip's vanguard reached the village of Crécy on August 25th, his men were exhausted from a forced march under a punishing sun. The French king ordered a halt, intending to rest and attack the next morning, but his command met the deaf ears of glory-hungry nobles. They saw the English camped ahead, their banners fluttering on a hill. To the proud knights of France, that hill was an insult. The enemy, outnumbered, far from home, dared to stand and wait. To them, every second spent resting was an opportunity lost. Even as dark clouds gathered, men began to ready their lances. Trumpets sounded without order. Commands were shouted, ignored, and shouted again. Philip's pleas for patience were lost in the roar of ambition. One count after another surged forward, each unwilling to be the last to charge. The heavens broke. Rain lashed down, soaking men and armor alike. Mud churned under hooves. It was as if nature itself tried to slow them. But pride cannot be reasoned with. Behind the storm, on the hill at Crécy, the English prepared in silence. Stakes were driven into the ground. Bows were unstrung and kept dry beneath helmets. Edward's men did not cheer. They did not move. They simply waited. The French thundered toward them, banners whipping in the wind. A wall of steel, arrogance, and destiny. None of them knew that within hours, all that brilliance would lie still, buried under the same mud they had mocked. On the evening before the storm, the English camp at Crécy was eerily calm. There were no songs, no boasts, no prayers shouted to heaven, only the quiet rhythm of preparation. Edward III moved among his men like a craftsman inspecting his work. Every archer, every stake, every line of defense was precisely where it needed to be. His army was small, but it was disciplined. Each man understood his role. The knights dismounted from their horses, choosing to fight on foot beside the common. Soldiers, a decision that shocked even their own ranks. For centuries, nobles had fought from horseback, symbols of divine authority and prestige. To fight shoulder to shoulder with peasants was, to them, an insult. But Edward saw it differently. He knew that armor and pride could not win against precision and unity. The battlefield itself was his masterpiece. The English held the high ground, a sloping ridge that forced any attacker to climb uphill through heavy mud. At the base of that hill, the king's engineers dug pits and trenches to break the momentum of cavalry. Wooden stakes were hammered into the earth, angled outward to impale charging horses. Every contour of the terrain was turned into a trap. The archers took position along the flanks, forming a wide V that funneled the enemy toward the center. It wasn't random. It was mathematics in motion. From those angles, they could rain arrows from both sides, crossing their fields of fire into a deadly cone. These archers were not nobles. They were butchers, shepherds, thieves, and sons of farmers, but they had spent their lives with one tool, the longbow, 6 feet of yew, simple and deadly. They had trained since childhood because the law demanded it. In England, archery was not a sport. It was survival. Every Sunday, while others prayed, these men drew their bows until their bones bent under the strain. A trained archer could release 12 arrows a minute, 1 every 5 seconds. Multiply that by 5,000 men, and the sky itself became a weapon. Archaeologists, centuries later, would find skeletons with warped spines and thickened shoulders, the mark of the English bowman. Their bodies were shaped by years of drawing a weapon that required the strength of 2 men to pull. That night, they worked by torchlight. Bowstrings were rubbed with beeswax to resist the coming rain. Arrows were laid out in neat bundles, their iron tips gleaming red in the firelight. Men whispered jokes, tightened armor, said quiet prayers. Edward, calm and deliberate, ordered his son, the 17-year-old Prince of Wales, to command 1 division. The boy would later be known by a name that still echoes through history, the Black Prince. Across the valley, chaos reigned. The French camp was a carnival of noise, drunken laughter, feasting, shouting, the braying of horses. Philip Thix tried to impose order, but the tide of ego was too strong. His army was vast, but his control was slipping with every hour. Just before dawn, the sky cracked with thunder. A heavy rain began to fall, soaking the valley. The English unstrung their bows and covered the strings under helmets and cloaks. The French did not. Their Genoese crossbowmen, elite mercenaries, left their weapons strung, letting the cords stretch and weaken under the downpour. When the storm passed, the field was a swamp of mud and tension. Mist clung to the ground. Crows circled overhead, sensing what was to come. Edward's men stood in silence, their bows dry, their stakes sharp, their nerves steady. On the opposite ridge, the proudest army in Europe began to move, a tide of steel descending into ruin. The Battle of Crecy was about to begin. The storm had barely passed when the horns began to sound. Trumpets blared across the valley as the French vanguard lurched forward, eager to crush the English before sunset. King Philip VI had ordered a delay until morning, but his words vanished beneath the roar of impatient nobles. They would not wait. Not when glory was within sight. At the front of this unruly advance marched the Genoese crossbowmen, 5,000 mercenaries armed with powerful steel bows. They were professionals, hired to soften the English lines before the cavalry struck. But that morning, everything was against them. Their heavy shields, called pavises, were still with the baggage train far behind. Their crossbow strings, soaked by rain, sagged uselessly. They were walking into death, though they didn't know it yet. As the Genoese approached within range, they loosed their first volley. The bolts arced through the air and fell short, harmlessly clattering against the hill. Then came the reply. 1,000 bowstrings snapped back at once, releasing a storm. The English longbowmen had waited for this moment. Their bows dry, their aim steady, the sky darkened with arrows. Witnesses would later say it sounded like thunder, like tearing cloth, like the sky itself was screaming. In a single minute, 60,000 arrows fell upon the Genoese. Panic tore through their ranks. Men dropped their weapons and fled, shielding their heads with bare hands. The French knights behind them, blinded by pride, mistook retreat for cowardice. Count d'Alençon, furious, shouted, "Cut down this rabble that blocks our way!" and the French cavalry obeyed. Swords flashed, hooves crushed skulls. The Genoese, allies moments ago, were slaughtered by their own side. Then, through the chaos and blood, the knights of France charged. 12,000 armoured men thundered forward, banners snapping in the wind, the ground shaking beneath their charge. It was a sight that had ruled Europe for centuries, the unstoppable wall of mounted nobility. But Crécy was no tournament field. The hill was slick with mud, torn by ditches and wooden stakes. The horses stumbled. The first wave crashed against the English line and shattered like glass. Arrows tore through flesh and armour alike. The longbow didn't need to pierce plate to kill. It found the weak points. The eyes of horses, the joints of armour, the unguarded necks beneath helmets. Knights fell in heaps, trapped beneath their own dying horses. Those who rose again were struck down by the next volley. Each arrow was like a hammer, denting armour, breaking ribs, stunning men inside their steel shells. The air filled with the screams of men and beasts. Still, the French came. Wave after wave, pride refusing to yield. 16 charges would break against that hill before the sun set. Between volleys, English archers ran forward to pull arrows from the dead and dying, firing them back into the melee. The French were dying by their own weapons, their own arrogance. And amid this madness rode a figure who should never have been there, John of Bohemia, blind for 10 years, but determined not to die in bed. When told the battle was lost, he is said to have declared, "The King of Bohemia does not flee." He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his, so that he might strike at least one blow. They charged together into the wall of arrows, the blind leading the blind into legend. When his body was found later, John's hands were still on his sword, his horse still tied to his fallen companions. He had died exactly as he had wished, in battle, facing the sound of war. The French king himself was wounded, an arrow tearing through his jaw. His banner fell. His army, the pride of Europe, lay in heaps of steel and flesh. The sun slipped below the horizon, and Crécy fell silent. The age of chivalry had just died, and it died screaming. When dawn crept over the Field of Crécy, the mist revealed not an army, but a graveyard. The proudest men in France, princes, dukes, counts, lay twisted in the mud, their armour dented and broken, their banners soaked in blood. The scent of rain and iron hung heavy in the air. What had begun as a march of nobility ended as a slaughter beyond reason. Edward III's men, stunned by the scale of their victory, remained on guard through the night, killing any wounded French who dared move. They had run out of arrows long before midnight and had finished the battle with hammers, daggers, and stakes. Peasant archers, men who owned nothing, had beaten nobles to death with wooden clubs. By morning, it was hard to tell the difference between a knight and a corpse. As the fog lifted, the cost became clear. 1,500 nobles were dead, 11 princes, thousands of knights, the cream of French aristocracy, erased in a single afternoon. The English had lost 40, not 400, 40. For the French, it was unthinkable. For centuries, war had been a game of ransom and reputation. Captured nobles were to be held, not killed, their lives worth fortunes in gold. But the archers at Crécy had no use for such customs. They didn't care for coats of arms or titles. To them, every man who charged that hill was just another target, and that was the true wound Crécy left upon Europe. Not the death of its knights, but the death of its illusion. For 500 years, the nobility had believed themselves chosen by God to rule and to fight. Their armour was divine protection, their blood sacred. But on that muddy slope, they discovered that arrows did not discriminate. In the days that followed, the horror deepened. So many nobles had died that there weren't enough men of rank left to bury them properly. Bodies rotted where they fell. Wolves and crows feasted until their bellies swelled. Locals later said the carrion birds grew so fat on princely flesh they could no longer fly, hopping from corpse to corpse across the battlefield. Peasants crept in at night to strip armour, rings, and coin from the dead. For some, that single night's scavenging made them richer than they had ever imagined. The armour that had once symbolised power was melted and sold by the same peasants it had been meant to crush. News of the defeat spread across France like a plague. Entire provinces were leaderless. Estates went ungoverned. The French crown, humiliated, was forced to rebuild from ashes. The mighty chivalric order, the belief that courage, faith, and noble birth determined destiny, had died at Crécy. In its place rose something colder, sharper and far more efficient: strategy, discipline and firepower. For Edward III, Crécy was not merely a victory, it was a revelation. He had proved that leadership and preparation could shatter divine right. His archers had changed the mathematics of war, but even their triumph would not last forever. The longbow, for all its power, demanded years of training, a lifetime to master. When gunpowder arrived, it did in months what the bow had done in centuries. It erased the warrior class entirely, and yet the story of Crécy remains. The blind king of Bohemia became legend, his final charge remembered as the last pure act of knightly honor. His death was the sunset of chivalry, beautiful and tragic. But the lesson of Crécy was not about honor. It was about evolution. In one muddy afternoon in 1346, courage lost to calculation, pride drowned in strategy, and the medieval world, that glittering illusion of noble destiny, ended beneath a rain of arrows. Today, a quiet field lies near the village of Crécy. The grass grows thick over bones that once glittered in armor. Travelers pass without knowing that beneath their feet rests the turning point of an age. There is no roar of battle here anymore, only wind moving through the wheat, whispering the memory of the day the world changed. August 26th, 1346. In the space of a single afternoon, 500 years of tradition collapsed. The knight, that symbol of divine valor, of noble destiny, was undone not by another knight, but by the common man with a bow. No monument could capture what truly died here. It wasn't just France's pride or the bodies of her nobility. It was the illusion that courage could outweigh strategy, that honor could stop an arrow. For the French, Crécy was humiliation. For the English, revelation. For the world, it was transformation. The longbowmen of Edward III, farmers, outlaws, and laborers, proved that skill could triumph over birthright, that discipline could shatter glory. 5,000 peasants stood against an empire and won, and in doing so, they ended an era. So when the wind rolls across that quiet field, remember what it carries: the echo of bowstrings, the fall of kings, and the truth that history is not written by those born to rule, but by those who learn how to aim.